The coffee slipped from my hand before I even registered what was happening. 1 second I was holding the mug, and the next, the steaming liquid was splashing across Ethan's chest, soaking his crisp white t-shirt. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing a dish towel and rushing toward him. "It's fine, Diana," he said, his voice calm but slightly strained as he pulled the shirt away from his skin. "It's just coffee." But it wasn't just coffee. Not when his shirt clung to him like that, outlining every inch of his chest and shoulders. Not when he reached behind his neck to tug the shirt off, revealing smooth, tan skin, stretched over lean muscle. I froze mid-step, the dish towel limp in my hand, as he stood there, shirtless and unbothered, looking down at the mess on the floor. Do you have something dry I can borrow?" he asked, his tone casual, as if I hadn't just turned into a statue. I snapped out of it, heat flooding my cheeks. Yes, of course. I'll grab you something." I turned quickly and fled to the laundry room, grateful for the chance to catch my breath. My heart was racing in a way it hadn't in years, and I hated myself for the way my mind was spinning. He was my stepson, for God's sake. Ethan had moved back home temporarily to save money after college, and I'd been trying to keep things friendly but distant. This wasn't supposed to happen, but as I pulled one of Mark's old shirts from the laundry basket, I realized it already had. That moment, his shirtless form, the easy confidence in the way he stood there, and the way I couldn't stop staring, had ignited something I didn't know was still inside me. Something dangerous. When I returned to the kitchen, Ethan was leaning against the counter, dabbing at his skin with a paper towel. He looked up and smiled faintly as I handed him the dry shirt. "Thanks," he said, his eyes lingering on mine a little too long. I nodded quickly, turning back toward the sink, hoping the water would cool my burning face. But even with my back to him, I could feel the weight of his gaze. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. That moment in the kitchen stayed with me longer than it should have. Long after Ethan had left the room, his voice and the faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air. I told myself it was nothing. Just a fleeting reaction to an awkward situation. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It had been years since I'd felt that kind of heat coursing through me, that raw awareness of someone else's presence. Mark, my husband, was the reason for that. Our marriage had slowly eroded into a polite partnership. He was always working, always traveling, always just absent. At first I thought it was temporary, a phase we'd work through. But years passed, and we drifted further apart. The spark between us had been extinguished so long ago, I couldn't even remember what it felt like to be touched in a way that mattered. Ethan moving in had been Mark's idea. "He just needs a few months to save some money and figure things out," Mark had said over dinner one night. I'd agreed because it seemed harmless. Ethan was polite and quiet, and I didn't see the harm in letting him stay. But things started to change almost immediately. Ethan wasn't the awkward teenager I remembered from Mark's family photos. He was a man now, confident, charming, with an easy smile that could light up a room. He had a way of making everything seem effortless, even when he was just lounging on the couch or pouring a cup of coffee. And then there were the little things. The way he would brush past me in the kitchen, his hand grazing mine, or the way he looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to figure out a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. It was subtle at first. I caught myself watching him from the corner of my eye, noticing the way his shirts clung to his chest, or how his voice dipped when he spoke. I told myself it was harmless, just a reaction to the loneliness I'd been carrying for years. But the feelings kept growing, and the more I tried to ignore them, the more they consumed me. The morning after the coffee incident, I woke up early, hoping to avoid seeing Ethan before he left for work. But as I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, shirtless again, sipping coffee like it was the most natural thing in the world. My heart stuttered in my chest, and I froze in the doorway, unsure whether to go back upstairs or pretend I hadn't noticed. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and relaxed. He didn't seem at all fazed by my awkwardness, which somehow made it worse. "Morning," I managed, forcing my legs to move. I busied myself with the coffee machine, keeping my back to him, but I could feel his eyes on me, and it was impossible to ignore the tension that had settled between us. "You don't have to keep avoiding me, you know?" he said after a moment, his tone light but teasing. It's not like I've never taken my shirt off before. I turned sharply, my face hot. I'm not avoiding you, I said quickly, though the lie felt paper thin. I was caught off guard yesterday, that's all. He smiled, a small knowing curve of his lips that sent a jolt through me. Fair enough. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts, until Ethan finally stood and set his mug in the sink. Well, I should get going, he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of a chair. Don't work too hard today. I nodded, barely managing a weak smile as he walked past me. But as soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Ethan wasn't doing anything inappropriate. If anything, he was being perfectly normal. I was the one reading too much into it, letting my loneliness and frustration cloud my judgment. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feelings that had taken root. One afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone while Ethan worked out in the garage. I could hear the faint sound of music and the rhythmic clinking of weights, and curiosity got the better of me. I stood and walked to the window, peeking out just enough to see him through the partially open garage door. He was shirtless again, his back to me as he lifted a barbell. His muscles rippled with each movement, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just his body. It was the way he moved, so confident and sure of himself. I watched for longer than I should have, torn between guilt and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. When he turned suddenly, catching me in the act, I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding. I hurried back to the couch, pretending to be engrossed in my phone when he walked into the room a few minutes later. Everything okay? He asked, his tone casual but with a hint of amusement. Fine, I said quickly, refusing to look at him. Why? No reason, he said, but I could hear the smile in his voice as he walked past me and up the stairs. The turning point came a week later. Mark was away on another business trip, and Ethan and I were alone in the house. It was late, and I was in the kitchen, sipping a glass of wine and enjoying the quiet. Ethan came in, his hair damp from a shower, and leaned against the counter, watching me. You're up late, he said, his voice low and warm. So are you, I replied, trying to keep my tone light. But the way he looked at me made it impossible to pretend everything was normal. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. Can I ask you something? He said after a moment. Of course, I said, though my voice wavered. Do you ever feel like you're stuck? He asked, his tone almost hesitant. Like you're just going through the motions, waiting for something to change? The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, I just stared at him, the weight of his gaze making it impossible to look away. I feel like that all the time, he continued, his voice soft. But lately, I don't know, it feels different. The air between us felt electric, charged with something neither of us dared to name. And then, before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his hand. The moment my fingers brushed his skin, it was like a dam broke. Ethan stepped closer, his hand covering mine, and the look in his eyes was something I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just desire, it was understanding, connection, something I hadn't felt in years. When he leaned in, his lips brushing mine, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The kiss was tentative at first, filled with doubt and hesitation, but then it deepened, and everything else melted away. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Only him, only us, and the fire that had been smoldering between us for weeks. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, Ethan looked at me with a mix of fear and determination. Diana, he said softly, his voice trembling, tell me this wasn't a mistake. I stared at him, my heart racing, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. It wasn't, I whispered. It wasn't a mistake. The kiss lingered in my mind long after it ended. I barely slept that night, my thoughts spinning as I tried to process what had happened. It wasn't just the physicality of it, though that had been intoxicating. It was the way Ethan had looked at me, the raw vulnerability in his eyes that mirrored my own. I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years, but the guilt crept in quickly, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. The next morning, I avoided him. I stayed in my bedroom for as long as I could, pretending to be busy with work emails and ignoring the world outside. But eventually, hunger forced me downstairs, where I found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, his gaze flicking up the moment I entered the room. "Morning," he said softly, his voice careful. "Morning," I replied, keeping my eyes fixed on the coffee pot. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to act normal, or at least as normal as I could manage. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken words, until Ethan finally stood. "I'm heading out for a bit," he said, grabbing his keys from the counter. "I'll see you later." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The sound of the door closing behind him was both a relief and a disappointment. Part of me wanted him to stay, to talk about what had happened, but another part, the part that had spent years keeping my emotions neatly contained, was terrified of what that conversation might lead to. The hours passed slowly. I busied myself with errands, chores, anything to keep my mind occupied, but it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. The way his lips had felt against mine, the heat of his touch, the way his voice had trembled when he'd said my name. By the time evening rolled around, I was a bundle of nerves, unsure of what to do or say when he came home. But Ethan didn't come home that night. At first, I was relieved, thinking the space would give me time to think. But as the hours ticked by, relief turned to worry. I tried to convince myself he was just out with friends, that he needed space as much as I did. But when midnight came and went, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling settling in my chest. It wasn't until the next morning that I heard the sound of his truck pulling into the driveway. I was in the kitchen again, sipping coffee and pretending to read the news when he walked in, looking tired but determined. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Hey," I replied, setting my mug down. "You were out late. I needed to think," he said, running a hand through his hair. "About us." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I opened my mouth to respond, but he stepped closer, cutting me off with a look. "Diana, I don't regret what happened," he said firmly. "I can't. But I need to know if you feel the same way." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what this is or where it's going, but I do know I haven't felt like this in a long time." The admission seemed to take the weight off his shoulders. He nodded, his expression softening. "Then let's figure it out, together." That was the moment everything changed. The unspoken tension that had simmered between us for weeks finally boiled over, and there was no going back. We tried to keep things discreet at first, stealing glances and brushing hands when no one was looking. But it wasn't long before the secrecy became part of the thrill, adding a dangerous edge to every encounter. One evening, while Mark was away on another business trip, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the living room. We were watching a movie, sitting on opposite ends of the couch, but the space between us felt charged. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I glanced over, he didn't look away. "Come here," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the TV. I hesitated for only a moment before sliding closer, my pulse quickening as his hand found mine. He didn't say anything else, just pulled me against him, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that stole the breath from my lungs. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the warmth of his touch and the electricity crackling between us. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. The couch became our sanctuary, our secret, as we explored each other with a hunger that had been building for weeks. His hands were gentle but insistent, his lips tracing a path down my neck as I gasped and clung to him like he was the only thing keeping me grounded. For the first time in years, I felt desired, seen, and I never wanted it to end. In the days that followed, our relationship deepened. It wasn't just about the physical connection, though that was undeniable. It was the way Ethan made me laugh, the way he listened when I spoke, the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. He brought out a side of me I thought I'd lost, a side that was bold, carefree, and unapologetically alive. But with every stolen moment, the reality of our situation loomed larger. Mark wasn't stupid. He'd noticed the subtle shifts in my behavior, the way I seemed lighter, happier. He didn't know the truth, at least not yet, but I could see the questions forming in his eyes every time he looked at me. "Ethan," on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the risk. If anything, the danger seemed to excite him, adding fuel to the fire that burned between us. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Ethan cornered me in the kitchen, his hands slipping around my waist as he pressed me against the counter. "What if he comes home early?" I whispered, my breath hitching, as his lips brushed against my ear. "Then we'll deal with it," he murmured, his voice low and teasing. "But right now, I can't think about anything except you." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and all thoughts of caution vanished as I pulled him closer, losing myself in the heat of the moment. But as much as I wanted to believe we could keep our secret forever, I knew the truth was inevitable. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide the connection between us. And with every passing day, the stakes grew higher, the risks more daunting. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep everything under control. But deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. Sooner or later, the truth would come out, and when it did, it would change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen when it did. The affair unfolded like a secret world, one that existed only for Ethan and me. During the day, we moved like ghosts around the house, careful to keep a polite distance whenever Mark was home. But when we were alone, it was as if the air between us became charged, humming with an energy neither of us could resist. Every glance, every touch, every word exchanged in secret felt like a thrill, a quiet rebellion against the lives we were supposed to be living. Our first full day alone together after Mark left for a week-long trip was the beginning of something we couldn't turn back from. It was a Sunday, warm and sunny, and Ethan had suggested we spend the afternoon outside. I'd agreed, thinking it would be harmless, just two people enjoying the weather. But the way he looked at me when we were sitting in the backyard, the way he leaned just a little too close when he handed me a glass of iced tea, made it clear that our definition of harmless had changed. "Why do you always wear your hair up?" he asked, his voice low as he brushed a loose strand from my face. "It's practical," I said, though my voice wavered under the weight of his gaze. "You should leave it down more often," he murmured, his fingers lingering at my temple. "It suits you." The way he said it, so soft and intimate, made my heart race. Before I could respond, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was slow, deliberate, and entirely consuming. It wasn't like the desperate, fiery kisses we'd shared before. This one was different, lingering, filled with a tenderness that made me ache in ways I couldn't explain. That night, we didn't bother pretending to keep our distance. After dinner, I poured us both a glass of wine, and we sat on the couch, closer than we should have been. Ethan reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine, and when I looked at him, his expression was so open, so unguarded, that it took my breath away. "I don't want to hide this," he said softly, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Not from you, at least." "We don't have a choice," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "If Mark ever found out." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I know, but that doesn't mean it has to be any less real." His words stayed with me, long after he kissed me goodnight and disappeared into his room. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we'd gotten here. How something so wrong could feel so painfully right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of stolen moments and whispered secrets. We became experts at navigating the delicate balance of our lives, finding pockets of time where we could be together, without anyone suspecting. In the mornings, we'd linger in the kitchen just a little too long, brushing past each other as we poured coffee or reached for the same dish. At night, we'd steal kisses in the hallway, our bodies pressed close in the shadows, as we tried to stay quiet. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, Ethan found me in my home office, hunched over a pile of design sketches for a client. He leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed, a playful smirk tugging at his lips. "You've been in here all day," he said. "Don't you ever take a break?" "I'm busy," I said, not looking up. But when I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and solid, I couldn't stop the shiver that ran through me. "You need to relax," he murmured, his fingers brushing lightly against my neck. "You're too tense." I turned to him, intending to protest, but the words died on my lips when I saw the way he was looking at me. There was something in his eyes. Heat, yes, but also something deeper, something that made my heart twist. Before I could stop myself, I reached for him, pulling him down into a kiss that was anything but gentle. We didn't make it to the bedroom. The desk became our sanctuary, paper scattering to the floor as we lost ourselves in each other. His hands were everywhere, on my waist, my thighs, my back, like he couldn't get close enough, couldn't hold me tightly enough. And I wanted him to. I wanted to feel him, to let go of everything that had been weighing me down for so long. It wasn't always easy, though. The secrecy that made our relationship so thrilling also made it exhausting. Every glance over my shoulder, every carefully chosen word when Mark was around, felt like walking a tightrope. And the closer we got to each other, the harder it became to keep our emotions in check. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Ethan reached for my hand under the table, his fingers brushing against mine in a way that sent a shiver up my spine. I pulled away quickly, glancing toward the living room where Mark was watching TV. But the hurt in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. "Why do you keep pushing me away when he's around?" he asked later, after Mark had gone to bed. We were standing in the kitchen, the room dimly lit by the glow of the stove light. "Because I have to," I said, my voice breaking. "Because if he finds out, it'll destroy everything." "Everything?" he repeated, his tone sharp. "Or just the life you've convinced yourself you're supposed to live?" His words cut deep, but they weren't wrong. I'd spent years clinging to the image of a perfect life, a perfect marriage, even as it crumbled around me. And now, with Ethan, I was realizing how much I'd been missing, how much I'd been denying myself. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be with you without feeling like I'm breaking apart." Ethan stepped closer, his hands resting on my shoulders as he looked into my eyes. "Then let it break," he said softly. "Let it all fall apart. Maybe that's the only way to figure out what you really want." His words stayed with me long after he kissed me goodnight and disappeared into his room. They echoed in my mind as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if he was right. If maybe the only way to find myself was to let everything else go. But letting go wasn't easy. The closer we became, the more complicated things got. Mark started noticing the subtle shifts in our dynamic, the way I seemed lighter, happier, and the way Ethan seemed to linger in my presence. He didn't say anything outright, but I could feel his suspicion growing, like a storm brewing on the horizon. And then there was Ethan. As much as I tried to keep him at arm's length, he refused to let me. He was relentless in his affection, his desire for me, and the intensity of his emotions was both exhilarating and terrifying. One night, as we sat on the back porch, the stars glittering overhead, Ethan turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't mean something to me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You mean something to me, Diana, and I need to know if I mean something to you." The vulnerability in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but the truth was caught in my throat, tangled with fear and doubt. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how to do this." "You don't have to know," he said, his hand reaching for mine. "You just have to feel it." And I did. I felt it in every glance, every touch, every stolen moment we shared. But what terrified me most was the thought of what would happen when those moments ran out, when the truth we'd been hiding finally came to light. It was bound to unravel. The tension had been building for weeks, tightening around us like a noose. Mark's suspicion wasn't spoken outright, but it was there in the way his eyes lingered on Ethan and me during dinner. The subtle edge in his voice when he asked about my day. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, but every interaction with Ethan felt like walking a tightrope over a pit I wasn't sure I could escape. The breaking point came on a Friday night. Mark had been home more often lately, taking a sabbatical from work in what he called an attempt to reconnect with the family. His presence threw off the fragile balance Ethan and I had built. With him around, there were no stolen glances, no whispered touches, no moments where we could just be us. The house felt suffocating. That evening, Mark suggested a family dinner. "The three of us should sit down and have a proper meal," he said, his tone more commanding than inviting. I agreed, though the thought of the three of us at the same table made my stomach churn. I prepared a roast and set the table, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. Ethan joined us reluctantly, his jaw tight as he sat across from Mark. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by long silences that felt heavier than they should have. I could barely eat, my appetite lost to the tension hanging over the room. "So, Ethan?" Mark said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "How's the job hunt going? Any luck yet?" Ethan glanced up, his expression guarded. "Still looking," he said curtly. "It takes time." Mark leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing. "It's been months. Maybe it's time to consider something more practical. You can't keep floating through life, you know." Ethan's jaw tightened, and I saw the flash of anger in his eyes. "I'm figuring it out," he said, his voice clipped. "Not everyone follows the same path, Mark." The tension between them was palpable, and I could feel the conversation veering into dangerous territory. "Let's just enjoy dinner," I said quickly, trying to diffuse the situation. But neither of them was listening. "I'm just saying," Mark continued, his tone sharp. "You've been living here rent-free for a while now. Maybe it's time to start pulling your weight." Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I didn't ask to stay here," he snapped. "You're the one who offered. And maybe that was a mistake." Mark shot back, his voice rising. "You're not a kid anymore, Ethan. It's time to grow up." "That's rich, coming from you," Ethan said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're never even here. You don't know anything about me." "Enough," I shouted, my voice breaking through the escalating argument. Both of them turned to look at me, their faces filled with shock and anger. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the weight of their gazes pressing down on me. "I can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't sit here and pretend like everything's fine when it's not." Mark's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as he looked between Ethan and me. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan looked at me, his eyes pleading, but I couldn't speak. The truth was on the tip of my tongue, threatening to spill out and destroy everything. "Diana," Mark said, his tone insistent. "What's going on?" That night, I locked myself in the bedroom, my thoughts spinning out of control. I could hear Mark and Ethan arguing downstairs, their voices muffled but unmistakably heated. My chest felt tight, and I couldn't stop replaying the look in Mark's eyes. The suspicion, the betrayal. When the house finally went quiet, I opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the dimly lit hallway. I found Ethan sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard me, his expression weary. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, sitting down beside him. "No," he admitted, his voice raw. "I can't keep doing this, Diana. I can't keep pretending like none of this matters." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not that simple," I said. "Mark, he knows something's off. If he finds out—" "What if he does?" Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "What if he knows? What then? Are you going to keep lying to him? To yourself?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. The truth was, I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to reconcile the life I'd built with the life I wanted. "Ethan," I said finally, my voice trembling, "I don't know how to fix this." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "Maybe it's not about fixing it," he said softly. "Maybe it's about letting go of what's broken." The next morning, the tension in the house was unbearable. Mark barely spoke to me, his expression cold and distant. Ethan kept his distance too, retreating to his room for most of the day. I spent the afternoon cleaning, hoping the mindless task would quiet my thoughts, but it was no use. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and I knew something had to give. That evening, Mark confronted me in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on mine. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I nodded, my heart pounding. "Okay." He took a deep breath, his gaze hardening. "What's going on between you and Ethan?" The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I felt the floor shift beneath me, the weight of my lies threatening to crush me. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, Ethan walked into the room. "Stop," he said, his voice firm. "Don't do this." Mark turned to him, his eyes blazing. "What are you talking about?" Ethan stepped closer, his posture tense but unwavering. "You already know, don't you?" he said. "You've known for weeks, so stop pretending like you don't." The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face contorted with anger, and I could feel the walls of my carefully constructed life crumbling around me. "Get out," Mark said finally, his voice shaking with rage. "Both of you, get out of my house." That night I packed a bag, my hands trembling as I shoved clothes into a suitcase. Ethan came to my room, his expression filled with guilt and determination. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "It's not your fault. It's mine." We left the house together, stepping into the cool night air as the door closed behind us. I didn't know where we were going or what would happen next, but for the first time in years I felt free. Terrified, but free. The ride away from Mark's house was silent. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on the gear shift. The road stretched out ahead of us, dark and unfamiliar, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered. There was no home to return to, no foundation to fall back on. Everything I'd built, my marriage, my life as I knew it, was gone. I couldn't stop the questions swirling in my mind. What had I done? What kind of woman leaves her husband, her home, for a relationship that defied every rule of morality? But even in the midst of my guilt and self-doubt, there was a quiet voice whispering that I had done what I had to do. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living. We stopped at a roadside motel a few hours away, the kind of place with flickering neon signs and paper-thin walls. Ethan carried my suitcase up the stairs while I followed, feeling numb and hollow. Once we were inside, I sank onto the edge of the bed, staring at the worn carpet while he set the suitcase down in the corner. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, sitting beside me. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to begin." Ethan reached for my hand, his grip warm and steady. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." I looked at him, searching his face for reassurance. He looked so sure, so certain, but I wasn't. All I could think about was Mark, his anger, his betrayal, the life I had torn apart. And yet, sitting there in that tiny motel room with Ethan, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. The next few weeks were a blur of emotion. Ethan and I moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of town, far enough from Mark's home that we wouldn't risk running into anyone we knew. The space was modest, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a living room that doubled as a dining area, but it felt like ours. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. We fell into a strange rhythm, navigating this new life together. Ethan found work at a local auto repair shop, using the skills he'd picked up during his college years. I threw myself into freelance interior design projects, desperate to keep my mind occupied. The work was therapeutic, giving me a sense of purpose, even as I grappled with the fallout of my decisions. But the guilt never really went away. It crept in during quiet moments, whispering in the back of my mind like a ghost I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mark's face, his anger, his hurt, his disbelief. I wondered if he'd moved on, if he hated me, if he regretted ever letting me into his life. Ethan noticed, of course. He always did. "You can't keep punishing yourself," he said one evening as we sat on the couch, the soft glow of the TV illuminating his face. "What happened with Mark? It's over. You made a choice. We both did." "I destroyed his life," I said, my voice trembling. "I destroyed everything." Ethan turned to me, his eyes filled with an intensity that took my breath away. "You didn't destroy anything. That marriage was already broken. You just didn't want to admit it." His words cut deep, but they weren't wrong. Mark and I had been living like strangers for years, clinging to a life that no longer existed. Ethan hadn't broken my marriage, he'd exposed the cracks that were already there. But the past wasn't done with us yet. One afternoon, as I was returning from a meeting with a client, I found Mark waiting outside our apartment building. He was leaning against his car, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. My heart sank as I approached, clutching my bag tightly. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "We need to talk," he said simply. I hesitated, glancing around the parking lot before finally nodding. "Okay." We sat in his car, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Mark turned to me, his eyes hard but not unkind. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Why him?" I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "I didn't plan for this to happen," I said. "I didn't want it to happen, but it did." "That's not an answer," he said sharply. "What does he have that I don't?" "It's not about that," I said, my voice rising. "It's about me. About what I needed. And I needed to feel alive. I needed to feel like I mattered." Mark stared at me, his jaw tightening. "So what now? You think this thing with Ethan is gonna last? You think it's real?" "I don't know," I admitted, tears welling in my eyes. "But I had to take the chance." He shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "You've always been good at running away, Diana?" His words stung, but I didn't argue. He wasn't entirely wrong. I had been running from a life that felt hollow, from a marriage that had become a prison. But for the first time, I wasn't running alone. Mark's visit marked a turning point. It forced me to confront the reality of what I had done, to accept that there was no going back. But it also gave me clarity. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how to move forward. Ethan and I began to rebuild our lives, piece by piece. We faced judgment from those who knew the truth, whispers and side glances that followed us wherever we went. But we also found moments of joy. Quiet mornings spent drinking coffee on the balcony, late-night conversations that stretched until dawn, the simple comfort of knowing we had each other. There were challenges, of course. Ethan's youth and my past made us an unconventional pair, and there were times when the weight of our decisions felt almost too heavy to bear. But in those moments, he reminded me why I had taken the leap in the first place. "I love you," he said one night as we lay in bed, his hand resting lightly on my waist. "No matter what happens, I love you." "I love you too," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. The future was uncertain, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But as I sat on the balcony one evening watching the sun set over the city, I realized that I didn't need all the answers. For now, it was enough to simply be here, to be present, to be alive. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I stood in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea as the sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Luke had let himself in, like he always did, his presence a familiar rhythm in the quiet days that now defined my life. "Hey," he called, his deep voice carrying from the hallway. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway, holding up a bottle of wine. "I thought we could share this tonight." I smiled, but my heart fluttered unexpectedly at the sight of him. He looked every bit the man his father had been, broad-shouldered and confident, but with a softness in his eyes that made him seem younger, more approachable. "Wine on a weeknight?" I teased, setting my mug down. "Consider it an early weekend," he replied with a grin that lit up the room, a grin that felt like it was just for me. That smile. I couldn't put my finger on why it affected me so much lately. But there was something about the way he looked at me that lingered in my thoughts longer than it should have. I chalked it up to my own loneliness. 3 years of widowhood and too many quiet nights had a way of making you notice things you shouldn't. He poured us each a glass and settled into the chair across from me. The kitchen felt warmer with him there, like his presence had a way of filling the empty spaces I'd grown used to. My life wasn't always this quiet. I used to be a woman of purpose. My days were filled with laughter, with plans and people, with a husband who, for better or worse, made me feel like I belonged to something larger than myself. But all of that ended when Bill died. It wasn't sudden. His illness gave us time to prepare, to say goodbye. But no amount of preparation could soften the hollow ache that followed. I'd stayed in this house out of habit, out of duty. But it felt too big now, too quiet. Luke had been the only constant. At 28, he had his own life. Work, friends, the occasional girlfriend. But he still made time to visit. He'd stop by after work to fix something that didn't really need fixing. Or bring groceries even when I insisted I didn't need them. I used to think he did it out of obligation, but lately, I wasn't so sure. There was something about the way he lingered, the way his gaze held mine just a moment longer than necessary, that made me wonder. That night, as we sat across from each other in the kitchen, the conversation drifted easily from topic to topic. He told me about a coworker who'd managed to back a truck into a loading dock, the story punctuated by his laughter. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster, he said, shaking his head. You could see it coming from a mile away, but no one could stop it. I laughed with him, the sound surprising me. It felt good to laugh again, to feel a lightness I hadn't known I'd been missing. But then his gaze shifted, and the humor faded from his expression. He leaned back in his chair, his glass cradled in his hand, and for a moment, he just looked at me. I knew we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and the weight of what that meant was almost suffocating. But beneath the fear and the doubt, there was something else. Hope? For the first time in years, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something new. Something terrifying, but full of possibility. And for now, that was enough. The morning light filtered through the living room windows, painting soft streaks of gold across the floor. I stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the coffee machine as it gurgled and hissed, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. But it didn't ground me the way it usually did. My thoughts were elsewhere, on the events of the night before, on Luke, on the way everything had changed. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, the ceramic grounding me just enough to keep my hands steady. The house felt quieter than usual, even though it was no quieter than it had been every other morning since Bill had passed. But something was different now. Something I couldn't ignore. When Luke left the night before, he'd kissed me softly, his hands lingering on my waist, his eyes searching mine as if asking for reassurance. I meant it, he'd said again, his voice steady but tender. I'm not going anywhere. Those words had stayed with me, replaying over and over in my mind. I sat down at the kitchen table, the steam from the coffee curling lazily in the air. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts a tangled web of doubt and longing. I wanted to believe him, to let myself lean into the warmth and comfort he offered. But what we'd done wasn't something that could be taken lightly. The world wasn't kind to people like us. People who crossed lines, who didn't fit neatly into the roles society had assigned to them. And while I told myself I didn't care what anyone thought, I couldn't shake the nagging voice in the back of my mind that warned of the consequences. The sound of his truck pulling into the driveway broke me out of my thoughts. I stood, my heart pounding as I moved to the window. He climbed out, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light, and for a moment, I hesitated. Should I let him in? Should I tell him we couldn't do this, that it was a mistake, that the world we were trying to create was impossible? But then I saw his face, open, calm, and so full of quiet determination, and I knew I couldn't shut him out. When I opened the door, he smiled, the same boyish grin that had always undone me. Morning, he said, holding up a small bag. I brought breakfast. I stepped aside, letting him in. You didn't have to do that, I said softly. I wanted to, he replied simply, setting the bag on the counter. I figured you might not have eaten yet. We moved around the kitchen in silence, unpacking the bag and setting the table. It was such a small, ordinary thing, but it felt monumental in the wake of everything that had happened. When we finally sat down, the silence stretched, heavy but not uncomfortable. He was the first to speak. I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice calm but firm. Do you? I asked, raising an eyebrow. He nodded. You're thinking this won't work, that it's too complicated, too messy, that people won't understand. I looked away, his words hitting too close to the truth. And you're probably right, he continued. But I don't care. None of that matters to me. His honesty made my throat tighten. It's not that simple, Luke, I said, my voice trembling. There's so much to consider. What if we stopped worrying about the what-ifs, he interrupted, leaning forward. What if we just took this one day at a time, you and me, no one else? I swallowed hard, my hands twisting together in my lap. I don't know if I'm brave enough for that. You are, he said softly. I've seen it. You're stronger than you think. His words filled the room, and for a moment, I let myself believe them. I looked up at him, and the sincerity in his eyes made my chest ache. After breakfast, we moved to the porch, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The world outside was alive with the sounds of birdsong and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost deceptively so. Luke sat beside me, his arm draped casually over the back of the bench. We didn't speak for a long time. the silence between us filled with unspoken questions and answers. "I don't know where this is going," I said finally, my voice quiet. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But I know where I want it to go." I turned to look at him, my heart pounding. "And where's that?" "With you," he said simply. The weight of his words settled over me, heavy but not oppressive. I didn't know what the future held or if this was something we could sustain. But in that moment, as I sat beside him with the sunlight warming my skin, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. When he left later that morning, I stood at the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the road. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel as empty as it usually did. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how we would navigate the challenges ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't facing it alone, and maybe that was enough. "What?" I asked, my voice faltering under the weight of his stare. "Nothing," he said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You just seem different tonight. Happier." His words caught me off guard, and I looked away, busying myself with the bottle of wine. "I suppose it's been a while since I had company like this." "I like being here," he said, his tone earnest. "It feels comfortable." The room fell quiet, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward but full, like there were things neither of us knew how to say. When he left that night, I stood in the doorway and watched him walk to his truck. The bottle of wine sat half empty on the counter, a reminder of the easy, unexpected warmth of the evening. As he climbed into the driver's seat, he glanced back and gave me a small wave, his smile just visible in the glow of the porch light. My heart skipped, and I quickly shut the door, leaning against it as I exhaled a shaky breath. It was ridiculous, I told myself. Silly and foolish to feel. Whatever it was, I was feeling. But as I climbed into bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, his smile lingered in my mind, and I couldn't deny the small flicker of something unfamiliar taking root in my chest. The days after Luke's visit passed slowly, each one blending into the next in the way they always seemed to. Yet something had shifted. His smile, the way he'd said he liked being here. It lingered in my mind like a melody I couldn't quite forget. I told myself it was nothing. Luke was kind, thoughtful, and attentive in a way I wasn't used to anymore. That didn't mean there was anything more to it. But as much as I tried to brush it off, I found myself looking forward to his next visit. It came sooner than I expected. It was a Saturday morning, the sun bright, but the air cool enough to remind me that autumn wasn't far off. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters after breakfast, when I heard the familiar rumble of his truck in the driveway. He didn't knock as usual, just let himself in and called out, "Morning." I glanced up as he stepped into the kitchen, carrying a toolbox. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans, the fabric of his shirt clinging slightly to his chest from the warmth outside. "You're early," I said, forcing myself to sound casual. "Thought I'd get a jump on fixing that loose hinge on the back gate," he replied. "It's been bugging me every time I come over." I wanted to tell him it could wait, that he didn't need to keep finding reasons to help me, but the truth was, I didn't want to discourage him. He worked outside for most of the morning, while I busied myself in the garden, pulling weeds and pruning bushes. Occasionally, I'd glance over at him, watching as he bent over the gate or reached up to tighten a screw. His movements were fluid, confident, the kind that came naturally to someone who was used to working with their hands. At one point he caught me looking. "Everything okay?" he called, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Fine," I replied quickly, ducking my head and pretending to focus on the flowers. But my hands were shaking. Later he came inside for a glass of water. He leaned against the counter, his hair damp from sweat, and grinned at me. "That gate's as good as new," he said. "Thank you," I replied, handing him the glass. As he took it, his fingers brushed mine. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to send a spark of warmth up my arm. I froze for a moment, but he didn't seem to notice, draining the glass in one long sip. "You didn't have to do all this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged, setting the glass down on the counter. "I like helping out. Besides, it gives me an excuse to hang around." His words were simple, said without hesitation, but they hit me harder than I expected. I busied myself with washing the glass, unsure how to respond. "Anyway," he continued, his tone lighter now. "I should probably head out, but I'll be back next week. I noticed the gutters are starting to sag a bit. I'll fix those for you." "You don't have to keep fixing things, Luke," I said, finally turning to face him. "I know," he replied, his gaze steady, "but I want to." The sincerity in his voice made my chest tighten. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, walking him to the door. When he left, the house felt quieter than usual. Over the next few weeks, his visits became more frequent. He found reasons to come over: a leaky faucet, a broken light bulb, even an old birdhouse in the backyard that needed repairing. Each time, he stayed a little longer, our conversations stretching into the afternoons. We talked about everything and nothing. He told me about his work, his friends, and the things that frustrated him. I listened, offering advice when I could, but mostly just enjoying the sound of his voice. One afternoon, while he was fixing a loose floorboard in the hallway, I found myself sitting on the steps, watching him work. "Do you ever slow down?" I teased, resting my chin on my hand. He glanced up at me, his grin easy and boyish. "Not when I'm here. Too much to do." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help smiling. "Besides," he added, his tone softening, "it's nice having a reason to come over." The words hung in the air between us, their weight unmistakable. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He didn't press the moment, just went back to his work as if he hadn't said anything at all. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. The way he'd said it, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, it was like he was trying to tell me something without saying it outright. And the worst part, I wasn't sure I wanted him to stop. The days were growing shorter, and with each passing evening, the air seemed to cool just a little more. A gentle reminder that summer was slipping away. But Luke's visits didn't slow. If anything, he seemed to find more reasons to be here, and I found fewer reasons to question it. It wasn't just his presence that filled the house. It was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way his laugh echoed in the kitchen, or the way he stayed a little longer each time. Slowly, imperceptibly, the silence that had defined my life since Bill's passing was being replaced by something else. Something warmer, more alive. One evening, after he'd fixed the gutters, he stayed for dinner. It wasn't planned, but neither of us seemed eager to end the day. I made pasta with what I had on hand, and we sat across from each other at the table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting a cozy warmth over the room. He told me about a project he was working on at his job, his enthusiasm evident as he spoke about the challenges he was facing. I listened, laughing at his jokes, feeling more at ease than I had in a long time. But there were moments when the conversation would lull, and the silence between us would feel charged, like there was something just beneath the surface neither of us dared to acknowledge. At one point, he reached for his glass of water, his hand brushing mine as he set it back down. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a spark up my arm, a reminder of the tension that had been building between us for weeks. "Sorry," he said softly, but his eyes didn't leave mine. "It's fine," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. The silence stretched, and I felt my pulse quicken. His gaze was steady, almost searching, and for a moment, I wondered if he was about to say something. But then he looked away, breaking the spell, and the moment passed. A week later, the weather took a turn. Heavy rain rolled in, drumming against the windows and turning the world outside into a gray haze. Luke showed up that evening, carrying a bag of groceries and an easy smile. "I thought I'd bring dinner this time," he said, setting the bag on the counter. I raised an eyebrow. "Dinner, huh? Let me guess, frozen pizza?" "Not this time." He grinned, pulling out a package of steaks and a bundle of fresh asparagus. "Figured I'd try impressing you for a change." "Impressing me?" I teased, but the way his smile softened made my heart skip a beat. We cooked together, the rain providing a soothing backdrop to the quiet rhythm we'd fallen into. He seasoned the steaks while I prepped the asparagus, our movements easy and unhurried, like we'd done this 100 times before. As we ate, the conversation flowed as easily as the wine he'd brought. He told me about a fishing trip he'd gone on years ago with Bill, his tone light but tinged with a hint of nostalgia. I shared a story about the time Bill had tried to build a birdhouse and ended up with more nails in his thumb than in the wood. We laughed. The kind of deep, genuine laughter that left me feeling lighter than I had in years. But as the evening wore on, and the rain continued to fall, the space between us seemed to shrink. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling onto the couch with our glasses of wine. The soft glow of the table lamp bathed the room in warm light, and for a while we just sat there, the sound of rain filling the silence. "I like this," he said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Like what?" I asked, turning to look at him. "This," he said, gesturing between us. "Being here with you. It feels right." His words caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. I looked down at my glass, my fingers tracing the rim, and tried to steady the sudden fluttering in my chest. "Luke," I began, but he shook his head. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "I just wanted you to know." I looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. The weight of his gaze was almost too much, but I couldn't look away. There was something in his expression, something vulnerable, raw, and so achingly familiar. That made my breath catch. The next time he came over, it was late afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the garden damp and glistening in the soft light of the setting sun. I was in the backyard, pulling weeds from the flower beds, when I heard his footsteps on the gravel path. "Hey," he called, his voice warm and easy. I looked up to find him standing there, his hands in his pockets, his smile softer than usual. "You're early," I said, brushing dirt from my gloves. "Figured I'd catch you before you finished out here," he replied, stepping closer. He crouched down beside me, his knee brushing against mine as he reached for a stray branch. The closeness was unexpected, and I felt my breath hitch, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, neither of us moved. The world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us in the quiet of the garden. When I finally looked at him, his eyes were already on me, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Luke," I began, but the words caught in my throat. His hand brushed against mine, deliberate and gentle, and I felt a spark of warmth that spread through me like wildfire. "You don't have to say it," he said softly. "I know." The moment hung between us, heavy and electric, and I knew that something had changed. The line we'd been skirting for weeks was no longer just a boundary, it was a precipice. And we were standing on the edge. The sky was a bruised shade of gray when Luke arrived that evening. The soft rumble of thunder rolled in the distance as a light drizzle misted the windows. I had been sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the untouched crossword puzzle in front of me, when his truck pulled into the driveway. I heard the door creak open, his familiar voice calling out, "Hey, it's just me." His casualness had become a comfort, the way he made himself at home without hesitation. But tonight felt different. The storm outside seemed to seep into the house, bringing with it a tension that neither of us could quite ignore. He stepped into the kitchen, shaking the rain from his jacket and running a hand through his damp hair. "Sorry I didn't call first," he said, setting a small brown bag on the counter. "I brought dessert. Figured you might like some company tonight." His smile was soft, hesitant, as if testing the waters. I nodded, gesturing to the chair across from me. "Always happy for company," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sat down, close enough that the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the earthy smell of rain. The quiet between us stretched, broken only by the occasional roll of thunder. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said after a moment, his tone careful. "You're not," I replied quickly. Too quickly. I cleared my throat, looking down at my hands. "I like having you here, Luke. It's nice, not being alone." He didn't respond right away, and when I finally looked up, his gaze was steady, searching. "You don't have to be alone," he said softly. My breath caught. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. We moved to the living room after dinner, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He had brought a bottle of wine, and as we sipped from our glasses, the conversation shifted from light-hearted banter to something deeper. He told me about his frustrations at work, the long hours and the thankless tasks, and how he often felt like he was going in circles. I listened, nodding, offering words of encouragement where I could. "You're too hard on yourself," I said, setting my glass on the coffee table. He leaned back against the couch, his arm draped casually along the backrest. "You're the only one who ever says that," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of gratitude and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I smiled, shaking my head. That's because it's true. You're capable of so much more than you give yourself credit for. He tilted his head, studying me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. You always know what to say to make me feel better, he said, his voice quieter now. I don't think you realize how much that means to me. His words caught me off guard, and I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. I'm just being honest, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And that's why it matters, he replied. I felt his hand on mine then, warm and steady. The touch was gentle, but it sent a ripple through me that made my breath hitch. Luke, I began, but I didn't know what I was going to say. He shifted closer, his eyes never leaving mine. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. I know what you're thinking because I've been thinking it too. His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. My heart pounded in my chest, every logical thought in my mind screaming at me to pull away, to stop this before it went any further. But I couldn't move. When he leaned in, his lips brushing mine, it was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. I didn't. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the storm outside seemed to fade, leaving just the sound of our breaths and the pounding of my heart. His hands slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, every doubt and hesitation dissolving in the warmth of his touch. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless. My thoughts a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't untangle. I'm sorry, he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. I didn't mean to. Don't, I interrupted, my voice trembling. Don't apologize. His eyes searched mine, and I saw the vulnerability in them, the quiet plea for reassurance. Are you okay? He asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or to myself. We sat there for a while, the rain tapping softly against the windows as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I felt his hand still resting on mine, his thumb tracing slow, deliberate circles against my skin. It was a small gesture, but it grounded me, keeping me from spiraling into the guilt and confusion I could feel bubbling just beneath the surface. This changes things, I said finally, breaking the silence. I know, he replied. I looked at him, searching his face for some sign of regret, but all I saw was quiet determination. What happens now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. That's up to you, he said. But I'm not walking away from this, from you. His words sent a wave of warmth through me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. When he left that night, I stood at the window, watching as his truck disappeared down the driveway. The house felt different, heavier and quieter all at once. But I didn't feel as alone as I usually did. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there were boundaries we had crossed and consequences we would have to face. But as I climbed into bed that night, his touch still lingering on my skin, I couldn't bring myself to regret what had happened. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The next time I saw Luke, it was a Saturday evening. The air was thick with the last heat of summer, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the front yard. I had spent the day trying to focus on mundane tasks: laundry, sorting through old photo albums, even attempting to organize the cluttered pantry, but nothing seemed to quiet my thoughts. When his truck pulled into the driveway, my pulse quickened. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and moved to the front door just as he stepped onto the porch. Hey, he said, his smile easy, but there was something in his eyes, a tension, a question, that hadn't been there before. Hey, I replied, stepping aside to let him in. He carried a bag in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. I figured we could cook dinner together. I brought everything we need. It was such a simple gesture, but the familiarity of it made my chest ache. He was offering me something I hadn't realized I missed so deeply: companionship, the comfort of shared moments that felt like home. We moved to the kitchen, settling into a rhythm as we prepared the meal. He chopped vegetables while I seared chicken in a skillet, the sounds of the stove and the knife against the cutting board filling the quiet between us. Every now and then our hands would brush as we reached for the same utensil, or his shoulder would bump mine as we moved around the small space. Each touch was a reminder of the night we'd shared, and the unspoken tension between us grew heavier with every passing moment. When dinner was finally ready, we sat down at the table, the glow of the overhead light casting a warm hue over the room. The conversation started light. Work, the weather, a funny story about one of his coworkers, but it didn't take long for the mood to shift. "I've been thinking," he said suddenly, setting his fork down and leaning back in his chair. I looked up, my stomach tightening. "About what?" "About us." His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching. "About what happened the other night." I set my glass of wine down, my hands trembling slightly. "Luke, I don't." He held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish." I nodded, my heart pounding. "I know this isn't normal," he began, his voice calm but filled with emotion. "I know it's complicated, and I know you're probably still trying to make sense of it all. But I also know how I feel. And I need you to know that I don't regret it." His words hit me like a wave, and I struggled to catch my breath. "Luke, this is..." I paused, searching for the right words. "It's not that simple. There's so much to consider, so much that could go wrong." "I know," he said softly, "but it doesn't change how I feel." He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and for a moment I couldn't move. "I've cared about you for a long time," he continued, his voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "And it's not just because of everything you've done for me, or because you've been there when I needed someone. It's more than that." My chest tightened, his words stirring something deep inside me. "Luke," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if I can do this." He leaned forward, his gaze holding mine. "You don't have to decide anything right now, but I need you to know that I'm here. That I'm not going anywhere." After dinner, we moved to the living room, the wine glasses still in our hands. The air between us felt charged, every glance, every movement laden with unspoken meaning. We sat on the couch, closer than we probably should have been, and talked about everything except the one thing that was on both our minds. But eventually, the silence grew too heavy to ignore. "I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," I said finally, my voice trembling. "And?" he asked, his tone gentle but insistent. "And I don't know what's waiting for me on the other side," I admitted, my eyes dropping to my lap. He reached out, tilting my chin up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. "Maybe it's not about knowing," he said. "Maybe it's about taking the leap." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss that was both tender and urgent. This time, there was no hesitation, no second guessing. I gave in, my hands tangling in his hair as he pulled me closer, the world around us fading into nothingness. What followed was a blur of warmth and connection, of whispered words and quiet laughter. Every touch, every kiss felt like a revelation, breaking down the walls I'd built around myself for so long. His hands were steady as they traced the curves of my body, his touch reverent, as if he were afraid I might disappear. I could feel the depth of his emotions in every gesture, in the way he held me like I was something precious. For the first time in years, I let myself be vulnerable, let myself feel without questioning or holding back. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. When it was over, we lay tangled together on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. His arm was draped over me, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice low and soothing. I nodded, my head resting on his chest. "I think so," I said, my voice barely audible. He pressed a kiss to my forehead, his hold on me tightening. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "I'm not going anywhere." I didn't respond, my mind too full of emotions I couldn't yet untangle. When he left that night, the house felt both emptier and fuller all at once. I sat in the living room long after he was gone, the memory of his touch still lingering on my skin.